Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the surprisingly well-documented and often wildly misunderstood daily life of Roman prostitutes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up, or more accurately, you regain consciousness, in a space barely large enough to turn around without elbowing a wall. Congratulations, you live in a cellar, the ancient Roman version of a work-from-home setup, if your home was a broom closet and your job required body oil. These rooms were standard issue for many of Rome's working women. Located in brothels, lupanars, or stacked above taverns and bathhouses, they were tiny, windowless chambers that doubled as both living quarters and workspace. Think of it as a studio apartment, designed by someone who hates light, air, and privacy. Your mattress is straw-stuffed, possibly shared with fleas, and smells faintly of wine, smoke, and disappointment. If you're lucky, there's a small oil lamp. If you're really lucky, it hasn't been stolen. Your few possessions, some cheap makeup, a comb, and maybe a bronze mirror if times are good, are shoved into the corner like they too are tired of being here. There's no running water. There's no plumbing. There's a bucket you try not to think about. Bathing? That'll be a group activity later at the nearest public bathhouse, where the water is communal and the awkward eye contact is free. But there's no time to lounge, because your room is also your office, and business hours are whenever someone knocks, or barges in, or yells through the door. Yes, privacy is a modern concept. Here in Rome, walls are suggestions and doors are decorative. Most days begin with a quick clean-up of the room. Sweep out yesterday's dust, wine stains, and any lost sandals left behind by last night's visitors. Then comes the prep. Face powder, rouge, and enough perfume to qualify as flammable. You're not trying to smell good. You're trying to smell better than the guy in line behind you. You practice your best sultry half-smile in the bronze mirror, not because it works, but because pretending helps. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still riding the emotional high from that, because here in the cellar, every day begins the same, cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough dignity to make it to lunchtime. After waking up in your glorified broom closet, it's time to prepare for another day of impressing clients and surviving public judgment. But first, hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. There is, of course, no private bathroom. That luxury is reserved for the wealthy, and even they just had pots with ambition. As a working girl in a city that worships marble statues but accepts open sewers, your best option is the nearest public fountain or bathhouse, depending on your mood and threshold for awkward nudity. If you're pressed for time, and let's face it, you usually are, you go for the quick rinse at the communal fountain. Splash some water on your face, rinse out your mouth with wine if you're fancy, and hope the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no soap, but maybe you've got a bit of natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates your skin and your self-esteem. If business is slow and coins are jangling in your little purse, you might splurge on a visit to the public baths, the great Roman equalizer. Everyone's there. Merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and that guy who talks too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You undress, store your belongings in a niche you trust way too easily, and wade into tepid water full of floating philosophical debates and someone else's toenail. Inside, you sweat in the steam room, scrape yourself with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and enjoy a brief moment of being the cleanest person in your street, a title that lasts about 5 minutes. After the bath, you dry off, apply more perfume, and try to remember if anyone's invented deodorant yet. They haven't. To finish the look, a bit of chalk-based face powder, a hint of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and kohl around the eyes. Not to highlight your beauty, to hide the fatigue. Clients don't want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a sailor before noon. They want mystery, allure, and someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. Now that you're washed, or at least convincingly perfumed, it's time to get dressed. And while Roman society had a lot of complicated opinions about fashion, there was one outfit that made things very clear: the female toga. Yes, toga. That flowing white garment we usually associate with senators, emperors, and frat parties. But here's the twist. In Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a political statement. She was making a professional one. It was a visual billboard for, "I'm not a respectable matron, and I am available for negotiation." Proper Roman women wore the stola, a long layered dress that said, "My husband controls my dowry, and I go to bed at 9. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were denied the stola by law and required to wear a toga, often short, brightly coloured, and intentionally flashy. Think less Grecian goddess, more visible from across the forum. The look was usually accessorised with cheap jewellery, bronze or glass beads, maybe some loud earrings. The goal wasn't elegance, it was visibility. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-metre radius, subtlety is a luxury you can't afford. Footwear? Likely simple sandals, maybe even barefoot depending on location and budget. Comfort wasn't a priority. You're going to spend a lot of the day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a bad client or an overzealous moralist. Hair was its own ordeal. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing wigs, especially blonde ones, imported from Gaul. Blonde hair had a certain exotic appeal in Rome, kind of like imported luxury soap, only more alive. And let's not forget the finishing touches. Makeup. Pale face powder to contrast with red lips and cheeks, and thick kohl eyeliner to make your eyes pop. Or at least look less sleep-deprived. Once fully dressed, you looked obvious, and that was the point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, scandalous, and economically available, then congratulations. You were ready for another glorious day of being judged by society while being actively funded by it. So you're dressed, painted, perfumed, and hopefully not too hungover. Now comes the fun part. Drumming up business in a city where everyone wants sex but pretends they're shocked when they find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or be immortalised in graffiti. Preferably all 3. Let's start with location strategy. If you worked out of a lupanar, brothel, your office was already built for visibility. Brothels were often located near bathhouses, markets, or drinking establishments. In short, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Think ancient foot traffic optimization. Standing in the doorway, wearing your finest look-at-me outfit, you'd call out to passers-by with a mixture of flattery, negotiation, and time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. Hey, might sound desperate, but hey, rent was due and the next girl over just dropped her rate to 1. If you were freelance, it was all about roaming visibility. You might hover near temples, because nothing says divine inspiration like temptation, or hang around taverns, ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who still had some coin left and questionable judgment. But perhaps the most bizarre, and weirdly effective, form of Roman advertising. Wall graffiti. Yes, Pompeii has immortalised the genius of ancient street marketing. Brothel walls were plastered with handwritten reviews like, "Maritimus gave me the best time of my life," or "Felicia, 2 denarii, very fast service." These weren't just vandalism, they were ancient Yelp, unfiltered, unregulated, and very, very public. Some women even paid someone to write their name and specialty somewhere visible, usually near tavern entrances or on columns. Others let their clients do the writing, which, as you might expect, ranged from glowing praise to confused haikus about being robbed. All this made one thing clear: a prostitute's survival depended as much on marketing as on skill. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, someone else was getting the business. Because in ancient Rome, as now, the secret to success wasn't always talent. Sometimes it was just better PR. So you've advertised yourself. You've got the outfit, the eyeliner, and just enough confidence to fake a good mood. Now it's time to talk pricing, the part where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market while secretly judging you anyway. Let's be clear, there was no union. Rates were set by supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone bartered you down with a loaf of stale bread. For street-level workers, or those in lower-end lupanars, prices could be as low as 1 or 2 asses, a small bronze coin that wouldn't even get you a glass of wine. That's right, some clients were paying less than the cost of a decent lunch. If that feels depressing, remember, some women accepted food, sandals, or even promises as payment. Yes, in a city with an empire's worth of coinage, IOUs still existed. On the other hand, high-end prostitutes, often called meretrices, operated more like luxury brands. These women could charge in denarii, silver coins, sometimes multiple per client, especially if they had skills beyond the bedroom. Conversation, music, poetry, basic literacy, anything that let a client believe they weren't just hiring company, but taste. Some prostitutes even had niches, not architectural ones, marketing ones. Maybe you specialized in working with sailors, or performing erotic dances, or reciting poetry during the act. Don't laugh. Ovid probably inspired someone. The more unique your brand, the less replaceable you became. Repeat clients might get a discount, or not. It depended entirely on whether they paid on time or smelled like fermented cabbage, and if you worked under a pimp or brothel owner, a hefty cut of your earnings disappeared before you saw a single coin. Some women were enslaved, which meant they didn't get paid at all, just food, shelter, and a vague promise that one day they might buy their freedom if they somehow won the Roman lottery. Welcome to the lupanar, the Roman brothel. It's not luxurious, but it has walls, which already makes it more dignified than working behind a tavern. Technically, it's a place of business. Realistically, it's a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. The term lupanar comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which the Romans used as slang for prostitute. That's right. Your job title was also your animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most lupanars were 2-story buildings crammed between bathhouses and bars, perfect for catching foot traffic from half-drunk senators and bored sailors. Inside, you've got a narrow hallway lined with tiny rooms, each equipped with a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to reconsider your life choices. No doors, just curtains, for that open floor plan vibe. Privacy? That's something rich matrons had. You've got damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your shift wall. You're not alone, of course. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite known as the leno, pimp, or lena, madam. Their job was to take a cut of your earnings, promise repairs that never happened, and occasionally yell things like, "Work faster, he's important." Clients ranged from nervous teenagers to sweaty legionaries and balding senators claiming this was just a philosophical visit. Some were in and out faster than a dropped denarius. Others tried to talk about their poetry, which frankly was worse. During downtime, you'd sit near the entrance, giving your best "I'm flirty but dead inside" expression, while calling out to passing foot traffic. Marketing was mostly volume-based. 2 coins! Special today! I'll pretend to listen. And yes, the walls were covered in graffiti, ancient Yelp reviews etched lovingly into the plaster. Felix was here, twice, or Thais gives a good time. Occasionally someone got artsy and drew pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate. Confidence, however, was never lacking. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. A roof over your head, a bed, if you squint, and if nothing else, you'd always have a front row seat to humanity's weirdest parade. Not every Roman prostitute worked in a lupanar. Some preferred, or were assigned to, the equally glamorous world of taverns. If the brothel was a chaotic office cubicle, the tavern was more like working in an open-air startup, with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns, kolpanai or popinai, were where Rome's finest drunkards, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and guys named Gaius with gambling debts gathered to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For prostitutes working here, the motto was simple: serve the wine, sell the charm, dodge the gropes. A typical shift involved pouring watered-down wine into dirty cups for people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. With your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the denarii flowing, but not so much that a brawl broke out. Unless that brawl was entertaining, in which case, carry on. Unlike the brothel, taverns were technically food establishments, so you had the delightful backdrop of boiled cabbage, fish sauce, and body odour. It was an aroma that clung to your tunic and your soul. But it also meant you could upsell a client. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't reek of garum. Some women worked the back rooms or upstairs areas, making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others kept things more casual, offering company, lap-sitting, and heavily suggestive compliments like, "Your toga looks clean." This was high praise in Rome. Payment was often immediate. Credit did not exist. If a client tried to delay, you had options: yell, threaten, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye and a short temper. The upside: taverns offered more foot traffic and sometimes better tips. The downside: you were a waitress, therapist, and hostage negotiator all at once, and no one tipped for emotional labour. And of course, there was the endless soundtrack: shouting, dice clacking, lyre players trying to impress women, and the occasional argument over who invented democracy. Working tavern duty was unpredictable, exhausting, and smelled like despair. But it paid the bills. Sometimes, if the customers didn't vomit on your sandal first. For the entrepreneurial spirit with no brothel affiliation and too much confidence, there was always the street. Freelance prostitution in Rome meant walking the line between independent contractor and please don't arrest me. The Roman streets were alive with opportunity and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were called prostibuli, and they roamed the alleys, bathhouse entrances, marketplaces, and occasionally temple steps, because nothing says divine intervention like offering a discount outside a shrine to Venus. Daylight hours were decent for traffic, but risky. You had to navigate gawking citizens, nosy magistrates, and angry matrons who thought your existence was ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler, it wasn't. You dressed brightly to stand out. Think short tunics, flashy jewellery, maybe a wig made from imported German hair. It was less understated elegance, more visible from across the Circus Maximus. The goal was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him. Approaching a potential customer involved a delicate dance of flirtation, timing, and not getting mistaken for someone's runaway slave. You'd smile, compliment his sandals, and casually mention your rate before the local vigils, street guards, decided your entrepreneurialism was public disorder. Some clients were polite, others were aggressively cheap, and a few were very confused and just wanted directions to the bathhouse. You learned quickly to tell them apart, mostly by the level of eye contact and how many coins they jingled. Competition was fierce. You weren't just up against fellow prostibuli, you were up against free lovers, drunken party girls, and retired gladiators with a side hustle. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no security, just your charm, your wits, and the ability to walk very fast in sandals. Some carried small knives or relied on nearby tavern bouncers. Others simply prayed that tonight's customers weren't philosophers with commitment issues. Still, for all its chaos, the street scene had its advantages. You set your own hours, kept your own profits, and didn't have to answer to a Leno breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat or philosophical heckler, but at least you were your own boss, in a city where bosses were rarely the good guys. If you thought the life of a Roman prostitute was already tough, allow us to introduce your least favourite client, the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire, brilliant engineers, conquerors of the Mediterranean, champions of togas, also invented a dedicated tax on prostitutes. It was called the vectigul ex capturis, and it ensured that even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Congratulations, your nightly services just funded another aqueduct. The tax wasn't just unofficial pocket skimming either. This was a state-sanctioned system, managed by professional collectors known as publicani, men who were somehow both boring and terrifying. They kept detailed records, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while scribbling on their wax tablets. To legally operate, prostitutes had to register with the aediles, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector with an affinity for paperwork and moral superiority. Upon registration, you were entered into an official list of sex workers. Think of it as joining a trade union, except there were no benefits, and instead of a card, you got a branding. Literally. Yes, some sex workers, especially enslaved ones, were branded or tattooed with marks like Lupa or their owner's name. If you're wondering how that made clients feel, don't worry. The branding wasn't for them. It was to ensure you couldn't pretend to be respectable later. And the tax rate. It varied depending on location, class, and whether your clients were sad senators or discount gladiators. But it always stung. You paid per act or per week, depending on the region, and there was no deduction for emotional labour, uncomfortable silences, or existential dread. Refusing to pay could result in fines, arrest, or being barred from working, though enforcement was spotty, especially if you were paying under the table, or knew how to flirt with an aedile. Still, for a profession already swimming in stigma, this tax added insult to injury. Rome was essentially saying, "We disapprove of your lifestyle. Also, give us 10%. But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly say your labour was helping to fund another temple, probably dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't return your prayers. In Rome, being a prostitute meant you had legal permission to exist, and social permission to be endlessly judged. Yes, prostitution was tolerated by the law, taxed, regulated, even registered. But that didn't stop every senator, priest, and bored philosopher from telling you how much they disapproved of you, often while zipping up their tunic. Enter the moral police, not an official squad with batons, but a vast, unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and writers who all believed it was their divine duty to shame you while enjoying the fruits of your labour behind closed doors. At the top of the hypocrisy food chain was the Roman Senate, a group of ageing elites who believed in preserving Roman virtue, a concept they typically defined as whatever we're not caught doing. Many of them publicly railed against moral decay while maintaining discreet tabs at every brothel from the Forum to Subura. Then you had the aediles, Rome's actual public officials who enforced laws on cleanliness, order, and decency. Their job was to regulate brothels, inspect establishments, and sometimes fine women for being too obvious about their profession, which, again, was legally required to be obvious. You couldn't make it subtle if you tried. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca had a field day. They mocked prostitutes in verse, lumping them in with greedy merchants, loud women, and, horror of horrors, women who read books. And yet these same writers gave vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life. Almost as if they'd done extensive research. Even Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, got in on the judgment. They wouldn't speak to you, of course, but they'd walk past your street corner with a gaze that could sterilize a fig tree. Some even petitioned for laws banning prostitutes from wearing jewellery or entering public baths, which is rich considering many of their husbands treated bathhouse visits like part-time jobs. Working as a Roman prostitute came with certain occupational hazards, namely disease, injury, and whatever that thing was the sailor from Brundisium left behind. Welcome to the Health and Wellness chapter, where the only prescription is, hope you survive. Let's begin with the big one, venereal disease. Ancient Rome didn't have germ theory, but they did know that some men left you with more than a coin purse and a bad poem. There are Roman texts that describe symptoms ranging from persistent itching to things falling off that shouldn't. The medical advice? Usually a mix of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. Pregnancy was another ever-present concern. There was no birth control pill, but there were options if you had the guts and the budget. Prostitutes used natural contraceptives like silphium, an extinct plant famously over-harvested for this exact reason. Animal intestines as crude condoms, and wool tampons soaked in herbal concoctions. Effectiveness? Somewhere between maybe and miracle. If pregnancy occurred, things got complicated. Some women carried to term and raised their children, often within the brothel itself. Others gave infants up to foundling homes, or worse, the open streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but turning a blind eye, that was practically a civic duty. For day-to-day ailments, sore muscles, cuts, stress-induced rage blackouts, the go-to remedy was usually wine, opium, or a slap from your leaner to stop whining. If that failed, you might visit a temple of Asclepius and sleep on the floor hoping for a healing dream. Ancient wellness culture was less spa weekend and more mystical nap with side effects. Infections were common. Hygiene was ambitious. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, and absolutely no one washing their hands before sticking fingers where fingers had no business being. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Depression, trauma, anxiety, all part of the job. Rome didn't have therapists. You had fellow prostitutes, wine, and the occasional stray cat who listened without judgment. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, prostitutes weren't just dodging moral judgment. They were also trying to stay on the gods' good side, or at least bribe them for health, luck, and a low-maintenance clientele. Religion in Rome was a full-time job, and the gods were always watching, judging, occasionally cursing. But the divine pantheon had a few deities who were, let's say, more lenient toward your profession. First there was Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and general poor decision-making. Many prostitutes dedicated small altars to her in their rooms. Offerings of flowers, perfume, or a coin were made in hopes of attracting wealth, charm, or at the very least, clients who didn't smell like boiled goat. Then came Fortuna, goddess of luck. Given how random your daily income was, ranging from a gold bracelet to 3 mouldy grapes and a promise, Fortuna was kind of a big deal. You might wear a charm bearing her likeness, or mumble a quick prayer before a customer with too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals walked in. But religion wasn't all glitter and flirtation. The darker side of belief included superstition, omens, and magical countermeasures, because when in doubt, blame the spirits. You'd burn incense to ward off the evil eye, tie red cords around your ankle for protection, or hire a professional witch to curse a rival prostitute's hairline. Don't laugh. Curse tablets, called defictiones, have been found all over Roman brothel districts, many reading like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot. May her clients dry up. May she trip in the street and land in donkey dung. If you were enslaved, you might also pray to Mercury, the god of commerce and transactions, because let's be honest, your life was one long receipt. And if you were lucky enough to save up for freedom, Libertas, the goddess of liberty, got a private altar and a slightly more expensive candle. All this spiritual effort wasn't just tradition, it was survival with flair. When Rome gave you judgment, disease, and rude senators, the gods were your HR department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always accepting offerings. Love, in the Roman world of prostitution, was complicated. At best, it was a pleasant delusion, and at worst, a financial liability in a tunic. Clients fell in love all the time, or claimed they did, usually after 3 cups of wine and half a monologue about their mother. Some were sincere, some were drunk, and some were trying to get a discount. "But baby, I'm different," they'd say, clutching your hand like a tragic poet. And you'd nod politely, mentally calculating how much they still owed you. Some working women reciprocated these feelings, or at least pretended to. Emotional labour was part of the package. Smile, listen, pretend his toga doesn't smell like despair. For a few clients, you might even develop something real: attachment, affection, or just mutual exhaustion. But more often than not, romance was a dangerous distraction, especially when you remembered that Rome legally categorized you as infamis, meaning you could not legally marry a citizen even if you wanted to. That didn't stop people from trying. There are tales of prostitutes who fell in love with their regulars, who were promised freedom, marriage, a house with a garden, only to end up abandoned the moment another woman with better eyeliner walked by. There were also clients who genuinely adored their favourite companion, showering them with gifts, poems, and occasionally actual manumission, the legal act of freeing a slave. These stories exist, but they were the exception, not the rule. Among fellow prostitutes, real bonds were more likely. You worked side by side, endured the same insults, shared the same lice. Some of these friendships became sisterhoods. Others became quiet romantic partnerships, hidden beneath the radar of Roman patriarchy, which believed women couldn't fall in love with anyone except a man with a sword collection. And of course, there were lies you told yourself. That one day you'd quit, that your best client really would take you away, that if you could just save a little more, you'd open a perfume shop in Ostia and never look back. Maybe it wasn't true, but in Rome, everyone had a fantasy. Yours just came with better lighting and lower expectations. In the Roman world of sex work, beauty was currency, and youth was the exchange rate. So what happened when the blush wore off? The client stopped lingering, and your joints started popping louder than your earrings. Simple. You aged out, but you didn't disappear. Some women, having saved carefully, or miraculously had a client with both money and follow-through, managed to buy their freedom if they were enslaved and start over. The luckiest opened taverns or bathhouses, renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others became madams, linae, the brothel version of upper management. Less action, more shouting. As a lina, you didn't need to be young or pretty. You needed to be sharp, intimidating, and fluent in threats involving sandals and overdue debts. You ran the schedules, kept the books, and made sure the curtains were only mildly horrifying. Clients feared you. Workers pretended to respect you. The Edels sighed when they saw you coming. Other retired sex workers leaned into fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake walk through the door, predicting doom becomes second nature. A few became unofficial therapists, wise women, or herbalists, offering advice laced with sarcasm and slightly incorrect medical suggestions. But many simply kept working, because Rome wasn't in the habit of offering pensions to women who'd spent 2 decades in a toga. Older prostitutes still had clients, they just adjusted their marketing. Less blushing flower, more experienced, discreet, and tolerates poetry. Physical appearance mattered, but so did reputation. A woman known for conversation, kindness, or mind-blowing. Astrology readings could remain in demand long after her prime. And for those with no savings, no patrons, and no lucky breaks, the options weren't kind. You begged, you cleaned temples, you worked in laundries until your hands turned into shriveled olives. Rome didn't care how you got old, only that you did so quietly. But here's the truth they didn't carve into marble. For many, survival itself was the achievement. And if you made it to old age with your wit intact and at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. When people think of ancient Rome, they picture marble statues, grand speeches, and emperors with questionable family trees. What they rarely picture: the woman leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig, and mentally calculating how many coins she needs to not starve next week. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in the shadows. They've been kept there by history, carefully edited out of the noble narrative so schoolchildren could learn about aqueducts without asking uncomfortable questions. Yet they were everywhere. In graffiti, legal records, satire, poems, love letters, curse tablets, and receipts. Yes, actual receipts. They were a fixture of daily Roman life, even as society treated them like morally contagious wallpaper. What history usually gets wrong is the assumption that these women were powerless victims or morally bankrupt seductresses. In reality, many were savvy, adaptable, and, dare we say, better at business than half the Senate. They knew how to read a client, negotiate terms, avoid danger, and hustle a living in a city that cheered gladiators and stoned anyone who wore the wrong shoes.